All right, what is going on, everyone? I hope you're having a good day. Welcome into another episode of BuzzBeat. This is Brian Geisinger. Today, I'll be joined by Darian. Richie is producing. And for the topic of today's episode, we're going to be trying our best to answer a few different listener questions. But before we get to that, consider looking into BuzzBeat Plus, our private podcast feed, by visiting buzzbeat.substack.com. It's the same episodes, but they're released several hours earlier. And of course, no ads on those episodes. Welcome into September here. It's sort of like the doldrums of the NBA offseason, but really does, I guess training camp is only a few weeks away. I think even like some teams like the New Orleans Pelicans started having players reporting for maybe like a sort of like off-season mini camp type deal I saw online earlier. It's beautiful in North Carolina, or it has been the last couple of days. Looks like maybe fall has been creeping in here. But Darian, how are you doing here?
I'm doing great. Excited. I realized ESPN, at least the app, has updated like the schedule. So when you go to NBA, it shows the new schedule. So that means basketball is right around the corner. Happy about our team. Josh Green just picked his number for what it's worth. So it just makes everything that much realer.
What number is Josh wearing? 9?
I think he chose 10. I think 10? He chose 10. Yeah.
All right. The old Ish Smith number, right? Or I guess Ish was 14 last year.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's exciting. Like, this is the time of the year when schedules do start to turn over. I always enjoy when I see that on like Bart Torvik with College Hoops or Synergy Sports, like that type of stuff. So it is exciting. All of this is around the corner. And to preview some of the season, we're going to go ahead and jump into some of these listener questions. So Darian, this first one comes from Eric Berman at Eric Berman 72. His question is, how do you feel about the center position with just 2 centers on the roster? Mark Williams' health still unknown. So Darian, why don't you go ahead and get us started here with that question?
So the first thing I would like to say is that I feel as though this coaching staff more than likely views us as having 3 centers, and that you would count not Mark Williams, but Grant Williams into that. While that may not be traditional, while that may not be exactly how everybody wants to go into the season, I do believe that's how they see it. And in certain lineups, it's definitely beneficial. As far as just if we're just focused on the 2 listed centers, I'm a little weary just because of the fact that I think we've seen, even though I'm slowly gained more confidence in Nick Richards, we've slowly seen how him just starting night in, night out is not necessarily what you want. And I'm not saying that he's going to start over Mark Williams or anything like that, but we don't really know like everything going on with Mark Williams is back. I know they've mentioned how he's healthy now. He's mentioned how he's healthy now. It's just how healthy can you be? 7-footer, lower back issues. And then even before that, it's not like he's played. He's a bona fide veteran, so he's still almost, game wise, a rookie. When you want to, I don't even think he's played 82 games yet in his career, while only playing 2 seasons. So I'm not the highest on our center rotation right now. If we're just talking about Mark Williams and Nick Richards, it's in a weird place. I have all the faith in Mark Williams when healthy. Especially now that we do have Grant Williams to subsidize when teams go 5 out. It's just his health, and then knowing that if he does miss time, what relying on Nick Richards night in and night out can do for you, which is not usually good. That's the only thing I'm worried about. But I do understand the fact that it's not like there was just plenty of centers available for a team like this to get. So,
yeah, it is what it is. It's obviously a pretty similar rotation, sort of melding together what their center rotation looked like at the start of last season and at the end of this past season, with Nick Richards being sort of like the one healthy constant. Yeah, Richards is I've long been sort of like room temp on him. I think he's turned himself into like being a decent backup center. 1.37 points per possession last season out of the pick and roll. Not necessarily like an amazing lob threat, but can give you some vertical spacing to an extent. not much of a short roll guy. So you really do need to, feed him the ball at the rim. He's not going to give you any stretch or any pop. So he is like a little limited, like in terms of like what those pick and roll catches are going to look like and what they need to look like. Good with the empty corner, showed chemistry with, I think, several ball handlers on the roster last season, like LaMelo, Brandon Miller, Misic, Trey Mann, especially late in the season. So I think, I feel solid about Richards. You just have to keep your fingers crossed for Mark. Like, we just don't really know. He was I did see Mark Williams was one of, 20 or so former Duke players that was in Durham last weekend, coming back to Duke for their Pro Devils weekend. I know there was some pickup being done on campus. I'm not sure if Mark played in any of those games. It did look like Derek Lively was also there. He was going through some drills with Duke's incoming five-star freshman center, Kamen Malawach. So that was a little interesting. But again, don't know if Mark was playing. And there just haven't been a ton of updates, in terms of his health. But as far as how good the center rotation is, it is going to come down to that exact thing with Mark. He's the guy if they're going to be if they're going to sort of improve defensively, he's probably going to be the primary reason for that. He makes a jump and he's healthy and is able to play 70 whatever games. This is a team that I still think is going to need him as a pressure point on the rim, his ability to screen and dive. And I am curious to see what it looks like with him playing out of the high post, out of the elbow, 5-out, delay sets this season. Do we get to see more of that with a new coaching staff in place? It wasn't really something that was a huge piece of the puzzle before he got hurt last season. Is there any more of that with Mark this year? But you mentioned it, Grant gives them another option. Obviously, he's, undersized at, 6'5" or so for a center, but he can play a couple of inches. He's really strong. You can throw it to him, and he can do handoffs. He can pass. You can run corner action with him. You can go 5-out. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with Grant. And I think even if Mark and Nick Richards were both healthy, you still may want X number of minutes per game to be with Grant at the 5, right? Just closing out the half at the end of games. Anytime you're trying to sort of juice the offense a little bit, you want to be able to space the floor. And I just think there are going to be times where you are going to want to be able to go 5-out with LaMelo Ball. And you're going to want to be able to throw the ball to the elbow with Grant and then have Brandon Miller flying off of handoffs or running, split action out of the corner. So I do think there are going to be times where you're really going to want to, have that option and play through him a little bit. Just as an insurance policy, I know there's no expectations for Taj Gibson to play a lot this season, but if they needed him to eat some innings for them, they do have Taj Gibson on the roster as a veteran, right? He's not played a lot the last few seasons, but if he does play at all this year, it's going to be at the center, I would imagine. And they did sign Musa Diabate too, to a 2-way contract. So, who I believe is someone that would also function, nominally as your 5. So they have some guys that they can there's other than Mark, Nick Richards, and even Grant, there are some sort of further down the bench things that they could use to buy some time here and there if they needed to. But obviously it's imperative that Mark is healthy because last season was basically a lost year for him. And that's pretty disappointing because he's a promising young player.
Yeah, for sure. And just it sucks because you think about the games, he played 2 years ago, his rookie year. It's not like they were the most meaningful games in the world. You're playing against teams who are, shutting down players. While Mark looked good, it's just that you want him to be able to have that consistent, he's going against NBA talent night in and night out. And he was doing last year, but then, of course, he got hurt. One thing I will quickly say about Grant Williams is that I do like that he'll allow us to kind of go offensively when it comes to the 5-out, because I feel like last year before he was on the team, we were very reactive to it because we couldn't run it at all. So when teams did it, we kind of were just stuck. But this time I feel like Grant Williams gives us the opportunity to, put a team in that kind of position to be like, we're going to force your center to come out the paint. So it does help on that end as well. But I feel like no matter how this roster is constructed, offense really hasn't been our problem for the most part. It's really the defensive side of the ball. So we'll see how it fares there.
Yeah, it's just health. And like, you have to circle LaMelo Ball and Mark Williams for, bounce back seasons this year, hopefully. Mark missed 63 games last season, just to provide a little context. Before he went out with the back, almost 13 points per game, almost 10 rebounds per game, close to 65% shooting effectively from the field, 47 dunks. Obviously plenty of shots blocked at the rim. So, we'll see. Big year for Mark. Fingers crossed he's healthy. Okay, flipping up to the second question. This one comes from Peace Love Basketball at Carrie Dunn 8 on Twitter, I believe. The question is, which lineups are you looking forward to seeing, and what's your closing lineup? So I'll jump in first on this one. As far as I think starting lineups go, I think it's going to go in one of two ways. Assuming Mark Williams is healthy, I think the constants, there are four guys that they're definitely going to start: LaMelo Ball, Brandon Miller, Mark Williams, and Miles Bridges. And so is the fifth guy Grant Williams, or is it Josh Green? And is Brandon Miller, sort of nominally the 2 or the 3? I think is probably what it comes down to. I could see, maybe you disagree with that. And I suppose there are a couple other ways you could try to go if, Mann or Martin, if one of those guys could somehow play their way into that position, but I don't quite see it. As far as the closing lineup goes, I think it will look pretty similar to those lineups that I sort of just tossed out, with Grant being a swing piece for them, because he allows them to scale big or strong, or to scale small or big, which we were sort of just kind of talking about. And so if you want to be able to switch across the board late in the game, I mean, Mark has shown some ability doing that, in a pinch. But if you want to be able to switch against a pick and roll type team, you're going to probably play LaMelo, Josh Green, Brandon Miller, Miles Bridges, and Grant Williams at the 5. But if you feel like you need, some size and some pressure at the rim, some rim protection, then, you're probably taking either Bridges or Grant Williams off the floor and putting Mark in the place of those guys, or you're taking Josh Green off the floor, I suppose. So I think that's the lineup that they'll close with, that they'll start with. As far as lineups that I'm most looking forward to seeing, I really do think one of the ones I just touched on, which is LaMelo, Josh Green, Brandon Miller, Grant Williams, and Mark Williams, that to me strikes me as the one lineup they have that could potentially do some stuff defensively too, right? You got a rim protector, you can switch, you got some strength with Grant, with Josh Green and Brandon Miller. You've got 2 longer wings that are, good athletes. Neither one of them are A1 stoppers, but they're both solid. And if you do that, if you have those 2 guys, then you can also take LaMelo Ball and you can put him on the weakest, perimeter offensive player, let him roam and float around, which is when he's at his best defensively, right? Looking to be disruptive, get into passing lanes. And you've got multiple guys who can run pick and roll with Miller and obviously LaMelo. You've got a screener in Mark. You've got a guy in Grant who you can play through out of the high post. And Josh Green, hopefully, is a guy that can work as a cutter, a catch and go guy, and gives you sort of enough spot up shooting. So I just think that lineup has 2-way versatility and could do some interesting things defensively for Charlotte. So that's the lineup I'm most looking forward to seeing. I don't think there's a ton of lineup versatility on this roster, but there is just enough, I think, if you squint at it, especially because of Miller and Grant Williams.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you almost took every single word out of my mouth. I think the starter line is going to be very similar to what you said. I know some people have been saying we may be underrating how maybe the organization values Cody Martin potentially at that starting spot. But for me, I don't value him that highly, so I would rather have Josh Green.
It's just a health thing with him too.
And then he can't shoot, and it's so much that I see what they're saying, because there's been plenty of times in the past where you would think there's no way Cody Martin's a part of this rotation, not rotation, but this main lineup. And then boom, there he is. So I definitely see, like, if you're basing it off the past, very, very likely, because they've done it before. I just don't see how they can get away with it this time, unless it will be more of a, I would say, like a play on, hey, let's try to up his value a little bit to trade him, which I don't think they're going into this season thinking that, but I could see it if that was the case. But yeah, I think it's mainly going to be LaMelo, Josh Green, Brandon Miller, Miles Bridges, and Mark Williams. Closing lineup, I do feel like, similar to what you said, is going to be very similar to the starting lineup, maybe depending on the team or depending on, kind of the flow of the game. It could be Grant Williams closing games, and not to say that Mark Williams was having a bad game or whatever, but it could just be Grant's a better fit. As far as lineups I personally want to see, very similar to the one you mentioned. I guess I'll just replace Mark with Miles in terms of, I just want to see them go up and down the court, and that's just maybe just purely out of my entertainment. Basketball wise, it does make sense to have Grant there over Miles, and in certain situations, and in vice versa, as far as there's going to be situations where maybe it makes more sense to have Miles there. I think that's going to be something to look at, to see who do they take off in those moments where you really just need your best players on the floor. It doesn't matter kind of what position they play, what archetype they may be. I would be very kind of what they do there. Another like lineup I quickly would like to see is, I can't put all of it together, but like Trey Mann, Josh Green, LaMelo, insert it with Brandon Miller. I don't know how it would work, but that's another one where, just out of my entertainment, I would like to.
Yeah, some good options there. Couple other ones that I would throw out just real quickly would be, I could see the potential for, at times, if the Hornets want to get LaMelo off the ball a little bit at times, to get him up as a, mover, a screener. Obviously, he's a great catch and shoot player. Just kind of, if you want to be able to like dial him up some looks, not just have him have to go, pick and roll and let defenses sort of like corner in on him. Like, it would be kind of interesting to see lineups with LaMelo playing alongside Micic or Trey Mann. Just another ball handler, and whether those guys are sort of in secondary roles, or it's, they're sort of running in the they're sort of running in the primary role, and LaMelo's off the ball a little bit more along with Miller. I think there's some interesting stuff you could do there potentially when you need to sort of like try to get LaMelo going. There were times back in the day with Kemba Walker and Steve Clifford, or Kemba Walker and James Borrego, where they would try to get Kemba, coming off of screens and coming off of down screens and loop action and floppy action and all that type of stuff. They'd sort of like have Kemba play with another ball handler, or just get Kemba off ball in general. Maybe we could see some more of that with with LaMelo, and obviously Terry Rozier's gone. So just sort of like that security veteran, guard, playmaker, shot maker, resource is no longer there. So, you're turning it loose to some of these other guys. I'd be curious to see, like, if and when Nick Smith Jr. gets to play alongside LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller, like, can you put him in spots where he's able to be a connector and make plays and get some good looks from three? I mean, it's a tough rotation for him to like totally, snap into, but I will be curious to see if we get some of those minutes. I'll be curious to see like if and when Seth Curry's 3-point shooting becomes an important piece for Charlotte, just in terms of like sort of like giving them another guy that can run off screens and hit jumpers alongside Miller. Because again, no more Terry Rozier. Dallas Bertans is gone now too. Just like how important might that be on certain nights? And then the last thing would be, we talked about them going small and playing Grant at the 5. I think it could be kind of interesting to see if there's any moments where they go like 4 guards and wings around one of the centers. So if you get, LaMelo Ball, Trey Mann, Josh Green, Brandon Miller, as your like de facto 4, and then Mark Williams or Nick Richards. So there's some interesting combinations that they can try to get to. But as far as the ones that I think are like bankable, I think we sort of touched on them at the at the start. And yeah, Richie, ever the excellent producer, he's feeding us stats and notes here. He's mentioning Cody Martin has missed a combined 129 games
Jeez.
over the last 2 seasons, which is a lot. That was in 54 games and 75 games. So, Darian, any other thoughts on lineup combos? If not, we'll go ahead and keep it moving right along to the next question here.
Just one is I would like to see what a lineup with Tajon looks like, but without garbage minutes. I just interested to see kind of what players they feel as though will help him kind of ease his way onto the court, because I think that's a big choice. If you're really trying to develop someone, I think it's a really big choice on who are you putting him out there with consistently.
No, it's a great point, in part because it's like the way, again, we don't think he's going to play a ton of minutes with Charlotte, but it's like, do you want those minutes with him having the chance to get on the ball some, or do you want it to be like, he's playing with LaMelo, Trey Mann, Brandon Miller, and a center, and so like he's just really in like set screens and spot up mode, kind of like what path do you sort of value most for his development this season? It's a good point. And certainly like an interesting one to consider. Okay, next question. This one comes from Greg at Handles Messiah on Twitter. Great follow in Hornets land on there. Longtime follow of mine, and I believe a longtime listener of this podcast as well. But Greg writes in, and Darian, you can answer this question first. Greg says, outcomes for this team seem all over the board, but assuming they're all healthy and in the mix for a play-in spot, would you see that as sustainable or already near their top end?
Oh, man. So for me, just my strictly personal opinion, I'm in this position where I just need to see it. I thought last year, we had a chance, and I know injuries kind of happened, but even then, when you're watching the players play, it just didn't seem like even if we were healthy, we were going to be that good. Now, granted, the East was really, really weak last year, and it hasn't gotten too much stronger, at least in our little tier of the East. But I really just need to see it. I think that we have the talent to be in the mix for the play-in, maybe even make the playoffs if the East replicates kind of what they did last year at the end. I think we have more than enough talent. It's just going to be, and I believe I've said it here before, is what does it take? How long does it take this team to gel? And then what does it look like for Mark Williams and LaMelo Ball as far as getting their health? Because I think those are two things we're going to be focusing on this year, are LaMelo Ball and Mark Williams' health along with the team gelling. And that's just not an easy task. And to me, it doesn't matter what kind of talent you have. That's just not easy, working two guys back from significant injury. For LaMelo, it's 2 years in a row. For Mark, 7-footer lower back issue. So talent-wise, I think we have it. Outside factors is kind of what makes me think that we may not quite really reach that potential. But it's definitely there. I definitely see it. I actually need to see it, I guess.
This question reminds me a little bit of the one, Darian, we got a few weeks ago that was sort of like, there was another listener reader question that asked us if we thought through 20 games of the Hornets would be closer to 5-15 or 10-10. During that, I mentioned that their Vegas, win total over underline was 29.5. So like, they're probably somewhere actually between those two, in terms of like, what you would expect their record to look like at the, the quarter mark of the season. It's interesting, like hopefully like the health part is sustainable. Like, I don't want to talk about LaMelo Ball's ankles or Mark Williams' back ever again. Right. Like, I just hope those guys are healthy and can just play a ton and be on the floor. They're great. They're very good young players. I very much enjoy watching them play. And I just want to see them both have a full season of really getting to play a ton of minutes together. I mean, there was like, I think last season it was only about 130, 140 minutes that LaMelo, Brandon Miller, and Mark Williams played together last season. And all of that was before, the end of December, essentially. Just kind of a bummer. In this hypothetical, if they're in the mix for a play-in spot, so, they're probably, if that's the case, I'm guessing they're, somewhere from like 8 to 10, 11, kind of in that range. I got to say, to me, that might say, context is important, but like, to me, that might say more about where the Eastern Conference is, as opposed to like where the Hornets are in their trajectory and like in their development as a franchise. Cause you've got several teams that are going to be really, really bad and are just like outright tanking. Brooklyn, now that it has its picks back, the Washington Wizards. I guess the Detroit Pistons would seem like they're going to be pretty darn bad too. There could be other teams in this range like Toronto or Chicago.
The Bull,
yeah, maybe the Hawks, whatever. But so there is like sort of like a pathway. It's like if one or two of those teams is like not healthy and the Hornets have good health luck, it's like Miller and these other guys, Miller and LaMelo, Mark all make jumps. It's like I could like kind of see it, but I'm also not sure it's like wise to like really, really go for it. This is not necessarily answering the question, but this is something I've touched on a few times on the pod and in other places too. Like the Hornets owe a top 25 first round pick to the San Antonio Spurs. It's lottery protected. Assuming it doesn't convey this year, it will then transfer to a 2026 and a 2027 first round picks from Charlotte to San Antonio. It would be advantageous for the Hornets to hang on to that pick for a variety of reasons. So I think if they're like, even if they're just sort of in that mix, but it doesn't really seem like there's a ton of upside to squeeze out of it, you can define that in a few different ways. But in my mind, I'm sort of seeing it as like, they're playing great. They're sort of more closer to like the 7 or 8 line. They're playing great for Lee. The offense is clicking. The defense is like middle of the pack or whatever. But I don't quite see it. And really, they should be incentivized to be sort of like turning in the opposite direction if they get to if and when the time comes. We'll see. But I do obviously have my fingers crossed for good health from the entire team. But perhaps most specifically the starting point guard and starting center projected LaMelo and Mark Williams. Darian, any other thoughts on this question, or should we keep it moving?
Similar to what you said, I don't think it's advantageous for us to make the playoffs, but I'm never going to complain about the team making the playoffs. I kind of touched on this earlier on Twitter. And you brought up a good point. It just may be a more indication of where the East is than where the Hornets are. I would just hate to like make it and fizzle out, like just don't look like we belong. That's kind of my biggest concern. And I'm all for like just getting the experience. In every sport, there's plenty of cases you can look at where this team was nowhere near ready. They make the playoffs, and then when they do finally win it, those players come back and say that year where we didn't look like we belonged. I think there's so many cases for that in every sport.
What it probably is worth mentioning, if in this sort of like, quasi best case scenario, it's like if LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller are like healthy and look like all-stars, that does sort of like change the calculus a little bit.
Exactly.
But I still think it's like, those guys are awesome. But like, I just think it's very important for this team to be sort of like lined up for another lottery pick. And, it would behoove them to really be like thinking strongly about that and doing what it takes to be, have good odds in terms of the ping pong balls. And like, I get it. Like, I know a lot of people listening to this or that follow along with us, they want to see the team make the playoffs or whatever. So like, it's hard to advocate for them to like not go for it if they were like in that area. It's just like there is opportunity cost, But I can even remember like in like the fall winter 2022, one random episode as the season was like already falling apart that year. I was like, they should be hitting the brakes, trying to get the number 1 pick to get Wembanyama and keeping their eye on Flag, for 2025. And I can remember like there were folks that were not stoked about me saying that, but it's like, that's kind of where they are right now. Like, and I do think they need to be mindful of Cooper Flag at Duke and some of the other top 25 picks that could look really good moving forward next to some of these other young guys too. So we'll see. I think it will be if they end up in this scenario, it will be, for lack of, I should use a more clever word, but like, it will be interesting to see if the offense or if the front office leans into it, or if, there's a trade, and
there's so many things that could happen to make me be like, go one way or the other.
Yep. All right.
And unfortunately, I feel like our team is split. Like real quick, I feel like our team is split. I feel like a lot of people want to see LaMelo, Miles, Mark uh, Miller to make the playoffs to get the experience, and I get that. But
Yeah.
then I'm thinking about the other part of the roster because we saw how valuable role players are, and we don't have that. Like I like Josh Green, but Dallas got rid of him for a reason, and it's not like Klay Thompson is, Klay Thompson of old. So it's just things like that is where I'm honestly outside of health. I'm not worried about the other guys. I'm not worried about the people who are the leaders on the team. I'm worried about the rest, and that's kind of where my concern comes in and making playoffs with those guys. Like, do I really want to make the playoffs with Cody Martin getting significant minutes? It's more about who's going to be in those playoff runs with LaMelo and them. That's my concern.
Yeah.
I'm not actually worried about those guys.
Okay, we're gonna flip it over to the next question here. Obviously, just as a preface, Charlotte defensively has not been very good. Really since like the heyday of Steve Clifford. You probably got to go back to 2015, 2016, like those types of years. I think they were a top 10 defense in terms of efficiency in 2016, but last year they were 29th. This is according to dunks and threes and them adjusting for strength of schedule in terms of defensive rating. They were 29th in the NBA. 2023 season, the first year during this second era of Steve Clifford, they were 20th. And of course, that comes with them that last third of the season basically operating like a top 6 to 7 to 8 defense. Last year under Borrego, 23rd. 2020, that was in 2022. In 2021, rookie year for LaMelo Ball, 17th in the NBA. And you got to remember, those teams played a lot of zone defense. They were trying to force a ton of turnovers, but they played really small often, and they were just not really like locked in on that side of the floor. And then the 2019-2020 season, which feels like a billion years ago, they were 25th. So all of that to say, this question comes in from Matt at Gbro Matt. Is this roster capable of becoming a strong defensive team? Clifford preached defense, but didn't get much results. And he, of course, has the important caveat. I know injuries played a part. Look, one of the lineups that I tossed out at the start of this, the Josh Green, Brandon Miller, LaMelo Ball, Grant Williams, Mark Williams lineup, I think does have some like interesting defensive potential. Again, you've got the rim protection with Mark Williams, who can play drop coverage. You've got athletic guys who can guard in the perimeter, like Brandon Miller and Josh Green, that can try to. And Josh is not, great getting over screens at the point of attack, but he can do a lot of other good things defensively. You put LaMelo Ball in the situation where he can sort of like rove. You've got Grant Williams out there to switch or to kick guys out on scramble switch and to, be strong in the paint and to match up with, all of the just absurd, so like front court finisher types, your Giannis's, like those types of players. He can, he's maybe not perfect to guard those guys, but he's the guy for them now, especially now that PJ Washington is no longer there. But it's hard to see this team having like a lot of lineup combinations that are going to be like plus defensively. So for me, it's like, can they become a strong defensive team? Like, I don't think so. I suppose maybe there's a pathway for them getting to like maybe like not quite middle of the pack, but like just below. It's like, can this be like the 18th defense in the NBA? I'm guessing probably not quite. Like I do think they'll be like a better offensive team than they are defensively, but I do see there being, if Mark Williams is healthy, I see them having like a better floor defensively, next season than they did this past year. Whether that gets them into the middle of the league, that seems like a little hopeful, but I think there are pathways, and I think there are a couple of lineups that potentially could give them like a little bit more punch on that side of the floor.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Mark Williams is going to play a big part in it. If you look at like their stats from last year as a team, and really kind of sectioned it off till after the All-Star break when they, kind of made those trades, there were a few categories on the defensive side, and granted, basketball does not work this way, but it is something just to look at, where if you add in Mark Williams' stats and his performance, it moved the Hornets from being dead last or 28th, 27th in the NBA in specific categories to like 20, 21, 19, 18. So like I said, while basketball doesn't work that way, it is something to look at and it does kind of give me hope, but I don't think it will be like top 10 or anything like that. We're still missing a lot, honestly. And I think that our top talent is kind of covering that in a certain extent, even though those are mostly offensively. But I think that we score so many points at times. Like, I think even when, except towards the end of last year, we kind of fell off and couldn't even score 100. But for the most part, any rendition of this team in the last few years has been good offensively, and luckily it's just worked out. And teams just really, I wouldn't say that we were stopping teams. It felt as though teams just didn't have the gas to kind of keep up with us in terms of scoring at particular points. But yeah, I think Mark Williams is going to play a big part in it. Grant Williams, everybody in general, just being healthy from the get-go and building that continuity is going to play a big part. It's just, I don't foresee it being just some giant significant jump.
Yeah. I mean, look, we really like Charles Lee as a coach. So, and we'll see what he looks like as a head coach. I mean, Steve Clifford's a very good coach and a great defensive coordinator. His hands were tied to an extent because of injuries and just a really bad roster overall in Charlotte. But like, we'll see. Maybe Lee has if Charles Lee is like a top 10 coach, right away in the NBA, which that seems extreme, that's maybe not even possible, even like sort of like in a best case scenario type thing. Like maybe he's got some stuff up his sleeve that he can use to sort of like junk things up a little bit. I mean, Borrego getting that 21 team to 17th in the NBA was sort of like a miracle. I think a lot of that just had to do with they forced a ton of turnovers. I am curious to see. I'm fascinated to see what Charles Lee rolls out scheme-wise. I'm very excited to see that. Ultimately, though, I think this team's most played lineup, probably several of its most played lineups, are going to have LaMelo Ball and Miles Bridges in it. And I just don't think that's the pathway towards building a strong defense. So, all right, anything else, Darian, on the defensive side of the floor, or should we go ahead and get to the final question here?
I think we can move on, because the biggest thing is just, like you said, if they're going to include Miles, he's got to step up defensively, off ball particularly. But we've mentioned before that there's no reason for him not to be a better defender than what he is. If you look at him and just see how he plays, see his size, there's just no reason. So him stepping up would be actually pretty key to this, just almost as important as Mark Williams being healthy.
Yep. All right, last question. This one comes from Maxton Artis at Maxton NMN Artis on Twitter. He asked, have you talked about the schedule? What's the easiest part and the hardest? What stretch of games are you looking forward to the most? So I must say, before we started recording, I had to ask Richie. I could not remember if we had discussed the schedule or not. We haven't actually. I guess it sort of came out more recently. Couple of notes worth pointing out. Here are the first 10 games of the schedule. The 23rd, a Wednesday in October, at Houston, at Atlanta 2 days later, back-to-back with Miami. That's the home opener. Then Toronto, then back 2 straight games against Boston, Friday and Saturday. Yikes. Then at Minnesota, yikes. Detroit home on Wednesday the 6th. Indiana and Tyrese Halliburton come to town on the 8th. And then the 10th game of the season is November 10th. It's a Sunday, and it's at Philadelphia. Some winnable games in that first stretch, but also a couple that, man, it just feels like you could put the red L next to those. So that looks a little tough. They have 15 back-to-backs. 6 of those they have to travel, whether that's road to home or home to road. Yeah, road to home or home to road. Forgive me for that. I think for me, just when I was perusing this before we started recording, one of the most interesting parts for me, schedule-wise, takes place for them later in the season. And Charlotte has a home game February 7th against the San Antonio Spurs. It's their last home game before the All-Star break. So they play Friday, February 7th at Spectrum Center. They don't play another home game until March 1st. There's 3 full weeks with them not having a home game. That has to do with they've got a long extended road trip that's also centered around the All-Star game, because They're at Detroit on the 9th of February. They're at Brooklyn on the 10th of February, at Orlando on the 12th, which is a Wednesday. Then they're off for a week. Then they return to play February 20th, which is a Thursday night game in Denver. Yikes. Then they play 2 days later, Saturday at Portland. Feels like a winnable game. 2 more days later, Monday the 24th at Sacramento. That one probably not looking too good. Then a back-to-back while they're still out in the Bay Area, February the 25th at Golden State, then at Dallas, Thursday the 27th, and then they have 2 days off before returning to home March 1st, Saturday, take on the Washington Wizards. I felt like for a very long time, like that the West Coast road swings were always like just an absolute deal breaker for the Hornets. Like how many times it was just like them in Phoenix or Utah.
And I feel like it always happens at the worst time. Like it's never a good time, but it just feels like when we're at our lowest, it's like, you got to play everybody in the West in 2 weeks.
Now before that stretch of games, they do have a very long home stretch of 9, which the thing is punctuated. The last game of that is the February 7th game against Wembanyama and the Spurs. But then they're gone, And granted, one of those weeks they're off for the All-Star break, but 3 weeks with no home games, essentially 2 weeks on the road. Plus, who knows what they're going to look like by that time of the year. You've got the trade deadline coming up, etc. Like it's interesting. So I don't really know if that answers the sort of like the question, but that part, whether it's like the hardest part or the easiest part, like it does sort of like strike me as a very challenging part. So I would say like, if they're treading water going into that home stretch, of 9 games, they don't have like a winning record or whatever in that stretch. And then they've got this extended stretch on the road. Even if, you got a game against Portland, like that type, you got some winnable things in there. Man, it just, you've got Golden State, Dallas, Sacramento, Denver, Orlando. Like those are some really tough opponents. So I'll circle that as the toughest stretch, but Darian, I'd be curious to hear you and your thoughts on this part of the schedule for Charlotte.
No, that was mine too. And then you did touch on this a little bit. The games before, while they're at home, it's not like they're really that much better. I mean, you got Portland, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Brooklyn, Clippers, Denver, Wizards, Milwaukee, and San Antonio. So it's like, while those games are home before we go on that brutal road stretch, it's not like those games are walks in the park. You can even look at teams like Washington. We know how often this team likes to play down to their competition. And then you got San Antonio, where that's not a given going against Wembanyama, especially with the Spurs kind of looking to be a little better than they were last year. So it's just, Milwaukee is never good for us, whether home way doesn't matter. It's just those games aren't much better. Really the end of the year in general. Once the year turns over, it's just not pretty. And then to mention earlier, we don't start off that hot either. It makes me think, because I was thinking back to last year, and while the season, went off the rails, and so it was really hard to judge, but it makes me that schedule was a lot more favorable than this one. This one, I don't think there's a easy stretch at all in any imagination. Like, you could think about the first 10 games, and it doesn't matter how you feel about Houston. It doesn't matter how you feel about Atlanta. It really doesn't even matter how you feel about Miami. But then you got Boston back-to-back, and then you turn around and play Minnesota. It's just everywhere you turn, it's something like that in the schedule. So it makes those games that we should win, or you think we should win, whether that, against the Hawks, maybe even some of the better teams like Indiana. Well, it doesn't help when you're playing Indiana, but before them you play the 76ers, Knicks, and Cleveland. So it's all over the place. Every time you think you got an easier game coming, there's difficult games either following or before. This will definitely be a test. It will definitely be a test, but I don't know. It's an interesting schedule, and I would like to see how we handle it. I just don't think it's going to be favorable. team-to-team matchup, there's some times where I feel as though we have an advantage. Like if you look at Atlanta, I think that's a team that us fully healthy we can beat. But then you throw in the games around it and the other outside factors. It just makes you second guess that any game against Detroit, you can't automatically count that as a win because there's been plenty of times we've let them kind of beat us when they shouldn't. I always think about the Kelly Olynyk step back to win the game a few years ago. That was a game I think we were winning the entire game, and then all of a sudden just fell apart at the end there. I think we were moderately healthy when that happened. So it's a rough schedule, especially with this team, because you never know what you're going to get. I'm also curious with fully healthy, are we going to go back to where we kind of let teams punch us in the mouth, but then we use the offensive firepower to jump back in the game? Is that going to be a thing we try to do this year? I hope not, but it's just there's a lot of factors, and the NBA did us no favors.
Yeah, I will be curious to see sort of like what their like offensive counter punch looks like without Rozier. For all of the sort of like holes in Terry's game, his just like ability to be a microwave shot maker and get hot and shoot off of movement. I mean, I think Miller can take on some of those capabilities, but like I do sort of, as much as I do sort of worry about what this team's sort of like secondary shooting looks like at the other wing spot alongside Miller and LaMelo next season. And I mean, really, they just need Josh Green to like shoot it and like shoot it well. So fingers crossed for that, I guess.
And it's going to be a little different without Luka and Kyrie on his team.
Yeah, exactly. And he still should get looks, you know what I mean? But it's a different, in many ways, it's a different, it's being done in a different capacity. I just did want to mention too, earlier when we were talking about that stretch of games and how the schedule gets like a little wonky for the Hornets. They have that last home game before the long layoff, February 7th, which is a Friday. The game before that is home to Milwaukee, February 5th. Wednesday, it's a part of that 9-game road swing. That Thursday, February 6th, is the trade deadline. I don't see the Hornets necessarily being players at the deadline quite to the extent that they were last season, right? Gordon Hayward being shipped out, Terry Rozier, obviously that was ahead of time, PJ Washington. There's some stuff that Charlotte can do, some guys that I could see them potentially being interested in moving things around, but that part of that timing, man, like that big home swing into the deadline, into the road trip, into the layoff, into an extended road trip. I mean, the way this happened last season was like, if you like their roster was chemically different, after the deadline, and it's in a similar time of the year last season. So like,
and luckily we didn't have nowhere near as hard of a schedule. Like we played the beat up Grizzlies and the tailing Pacers.
So I don't see that being quite as I don't see them being sort of like quite as likely to like turn over a quarter of the roster or whatever. But like, there's some stuff that I could, they have an open roster spot. There's some stuff that they have some mechanisms in which they could use to be a facilitate a trade or be a part of a trade and using that to sort of like take on assets. I suppose there's a veteran or two that could fetch some interest, but I'm not sure I quite see that. So again, that just feels like a defining moment of the season for them, like late January into early February. Not as extreme as it was last season. But this year still feels like it's of note. So with that in mind, that's still a ways from now, although it's going to get here quickly. We would like to thank you for listening, tuning into this episode. Please make sure to share this episode on social media. Rate, review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen to those things. It helps us with the yield algorithm. And, we're probably going to be like still have a few more here, but maybe a little more spotty with some of our recordings. But certainly as we get ready for end of September into October, we will certainly start ramping stuff up ahead of what could be potentially an exciting season for the Hornets. So with that in mind, that's been Darian and Richie. I'm Brian. Thank you for listening to Buzz Beat. We'll see you next time.